Story 1. Marburg virus originates from Kaitum Cave in Kenya and has a mortality rate of 90%. It can be contracted simply by visiting the cave, making it both frightening and fascinating. Story 2. The story of the Uruguayan rugby team that crashed in the Andes and was stranded there for 2 months is truly astonishing. The details are mind-boggling. Story 3. Comordaban incident. A group of hikers began bleeding from their eyes, clawing at their throats, then turned feral and collapsed. Only one person survived. The reasons ranged from claims that it was a lie or exaggeration to theories suggesting they encountered a military testing site for nerve gas. It resembles the story of 28 Days Later, but in real life. Story for Joan of Arc and in general these young saintly girls from the Middle Ages who claim they talk to God. But Joan especially. Her story is beyond belief, and we know so much because much of the documentation remains. This 17-year-old peasant girl went to see Charles VII, Dauphin of France, to tell him that God sent her. That alone seems like a big deal, but it isn't. Plenty of girls claim to be inspired by God then. The big deal is she told him God sent her not to bless him, but to lead his army to break the siege of Orleans and then drive him to be crowned King of France. This is not fiction or exaggeration. It is precisely what happened, and through no small risk or pain for herself, because when at home she insisted with her parents that she needed to go join the army, her father assumed she would end up a camp prostitute, and to avoid the shame, he considered drowning her. Now imagine a 17-year-old girl today going to Volodymyr Zelensky and telling him, "Hey, I believe God says you need to make me commander-in-chief of your troops. I'll take care of the rest." That's what happened. Except it was 1429, and back then this situation was taken seriously. Charles VII was no fool. He thought, maybe this girl is just nuts. Here's the issue, though. That would never cross our minds today, but it absolutely did in 1429. What if she's not nuts? So what do? We test her. Charles sends her to be examined by priests and wise men who conclude 3 things. 1. Joan is not crazy. Joan is a good Catholic. Joan is a virgin, and that's a big deal. Forget it, says Charles. He gives her armor, a weapon, a horse, a banner, and an army. It's still unclear how this 17-year-old girl, who barely ate, managed to go around in plate mail, but she did. And she rides to Orleans, breaks the siege as promised, but not before sending to the English the most remarkable letter of warning, which I encourage you to read. It essentially says, "King of England, pull back your troops and leave, because I am a war leader sent by God. As long as your troops leave, I will show mercy, but if they do not, I will defeat them wherever I see them." And all of this is the least known part of her story, since her trial by the Inquisition is the most well-known. In that trial, they have a hard time accusing her of anything because, despite an Inquisition tribunal entirely bent on burning her at the stake, on orders from the English and with the tacit approval of the French who betrayed her, for whatever reason, this peasant girl, who it is unclear if she could even read, is able to avoid all the rhetorical traps they set for her. She presents herself so well as a good Catholic that the only way they manage to condemn her is because she dresses like a man, immoral and heretical for the time. Even so, the way the Inquisition worked was not simply to condemn you and burn you. You always had the option to admit your guilt, recant, and be freed, as long as you didn't commit the same sin again, in which case you would be sentenced to death. Joan is shown the pyre as a threat, and she decides to recant. She asks for and receives forgiveness and should be freed, as long as she stops wearing men's clothes. So what happens? We don't know. She is found dressed like a man in her cell again. One theory is that she is threatened by the guards with rape and feels safer dressed that way. She should be, after all, a prisoner of the church and guarded by priests, but she is, against Inquisition rules, in military custody. Maybe they just left her men's clothes, and she naively wore them. Whatever the case, they catch her, and she burns. It is said that in later years, as her legend endured and grew, her executioner became desperate, fearing he would go to hell for having killed a holy woman. Story 5. The administration of Saddam Hussein in Iraq was chaotic. Of all the psychopathic 20th-century dictators, Saddam did not have the highest body count, but he was perhaps the most sadistic. His sons were equally malevolent. Story 6. the Bolshevik Revolution and the Romanovs. We studied it in high school, and something inside me just sprang to attention. I'm not even Russian. I just can't stop researching the Romanovs and their family dynamics. Story 7. I keep coming back to the Erebus and Terror Northwest Passage disaster. Now I can't get enough of harrowing exploration stories. Please suggest some for me. Story 8. The Krakatoa eruption was absolutely huge. It produced one of the loudest sounds ever heard, massive tsunamis, and ash that filled the sky around the world for years, causing red sunsets and darkness. Global temperatures dropped significantly. Story 9. The 2008 recession. Everything about that era explains, like a map, how we got to this point in US history. I am obsessed with it. Story 10. The Nanking event was inhumane and atrocious. I can't stop thinking about the innocent people affected. Story 11. The Mexican Revolution occasionally comes to mind, prompting me to seek more information about it. Unfortunately, there is limited quality material available in English, and my Spanish is not strong enough to translate with confidence. Story 12. The Challenger disaster occurred when I was 3 months old, shortly after the first space shuttle launched in April 1981. I was 5 when the Challenger and its crew were tragically destroyed due to gross negligence. Whenever I discover new information or come across a new video or documentary, I am always curious to learn if there's something I didn't know. While nothing can change what happened or my perspective on it, I feel compelled to gather as much information as possible. Always listen to the engineers, not the bureaucrats. Story 13. The last Russian royal family, Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexis, experienced incredible privilege followed by violent extinction. They were a loving yet tragic family overtaken by extraordinary circumstances. There are numerous family photos, written accounts, including their own letters and official portraits available, providing a real sense of them as individuals. I started reading about them in the 1980s, long before their remains were discovered. It was one of the biggest historical mysteries of that time. I often wonder why Nicholas didn't at least try to get the girls out while there was still a chance. Story 14. Hiroshima. I visited a few weeks ago, and as an American, it feels unusual going to a place like that. The Peace Memorial Park is beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. Story 15. Chernobyl fascinates me. I have explored this topic many times and discover something new each time. Industrial catastrophes are a particular interest of mine, and Chernobyl is the largest one in history. Story 16. JFK and MLK assassinations. There is a great book titled Hellhound on His Trail, about the search for James Earl Ray that reads like a thriller. Story 17. There was a time I was obsessed with prehistory. I also explored some aspects of medieval times, Greece and the Romans and the Egyptians. There were just random curiosities. For example, people used to brush their teeth with coal and urine. Yes, you read that right. Story 18. For me, it is Italian organized crime in America from the formation of the Five Families and the commission by Lucky Luciano until the mob was dismantled by the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations act in the late 1980s and early 1990s. I am fascinated by the power these individuals had at the turn of the century. This may not be a specific event, but I cannot get enough. Story 19. The Maya and other Mesoamerican or South American cultures always have new and interesting discoveries. The event I used to be obsessed with was the misconception of the disappearance of the Maya. They did not disappear, and there are millions of Maya alive today. I really appreciate the work of Ed Barnhart after seeing a few of his series on the Great Courses. He also has a fun podcast called AskReddit. Story 20. Not necessarily one event, but the individuals who have died climbing Mount Everest, and their bodies remain there. Story 21. I find myself drawn to the September 11th footage each year. I recall watching people jump from the burning buildings and hearing the impacts on live television that day. Story 22. Not an event per se, but the Hindenburg and the history of airships fascinate me. The difference in comfort between airships and fixed-wing flight was like night and day. If it had been allowed to mature, international travel might have been vastly different. Story 23. The Vietnam War resonates with me because my dad was there. He has shared his experiences, but watching these documentaries is truly mind-blowing. Story 24. The Dark Ages. I know this has been debunked, but that era still feels eerie and dark to me. It comes right after the fall of the Roman Empire and before modern history. Story 25. Austro-Hungarian involvement in World War I. The soldiers had no interest in fighting. Most of them resented the war. Story 26. American slavery. I have been deeply researching the history of slavery, including the slave ships, their sales, daily lives, diets, living conditions, abuse, breeding, and torture. It is profoundly wrong, and I find it hard to believe it lasted for so long, all for the production of cotton, sugar, and tobacco. Story 27. Lake Nyos disaster. What other natural disasters might be waiting for us to tragically discover? Story 28. September 11th literally happened 3 days before I was set to leave for my freshman year of college, where I pretty much lived in a bubble for 4 years. After graduation, it seemed like the world was a different place. Even though there is not much new to learn more than 20 years later, I still find myself watching every new documentary on it or just watching National Institute of Standards and Technology footage online. Growing up in the late 1980s and 1990s, it seemed like America was full of optimism, and I still find it fascinating that a small group of 19 men took that all away. Story 29. Chernobyl changed the course of history, rendering an entire region uninhabitable. The images of the interior of the reactor and the inner sarcophagus are intriguing. Story 30. As a former Mormon, I can't believe how incorrect I was about what I claimed to believe for 3 decades. Story 31. Anything involving the Central Intelligence Agency overthrowing situations that were not their concern is troubling. The concept of banana republics is particularly fascinating to me. That whole section of history was not long ago and was largely overlooked in my history classes. It highlights the danger of allowing large corporations to gain excessive power and transforming capitalism into a form of dictatorship. Story 32. The North American chestnut blight affected the old-growth forests in the northeastern part of what is now the United States. Those ecosystems were truly enchanting. It is difficult to imagine how the world was then, knowing how it is now. I think about it almost every day. It's not healthy. So much was lost to the insatiable greed of colonial expansion, and the chestnut trees were not even the worst of it. Story 33. Mass graves in Chicago are not an isolated incident. They are associated with multiple events throughout history. These include the Poor Farm and Insane Asylum, as well as Confederate soldiers. Even as recently as the 1990s, there were 68 unclaimed deceased individuals from a heat wave. While I may not actively seek out these stories, I often come across historical events and locations that lead me to delve deeper into the topic of mass graves once more. Story 34. The American space program represents a significant achievement in exploration. Many technologies and remarkable individuals emerged from this endeavor. Story 35. The Christmas truce in World War I is something truly beautiful. It is important to focus on the goodness of that moment, rather than what happened the next day. Story 36. Lately, I have been reading about Theodore Roosevelt, particularly an expedition he led from 1913 to 1914 to map a newly discovered river in the Amazon basin. The expedition faced numerous challenges, and Roosevelt narrowly escaped danger. I recommend the book by Candace Millard titled The River of Doubt. Next, I am interested in Stephen Oates' biography of John Brown, To Purge This Land with Blood. Story 37. Polar exploration, especially the Franklin expedition, fascinates me. I have a fondness for doomed expeditions in harsh and inhospitable areas. Story 38. The Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BC, every sophisticated culture around the Mediterranean fell apart. The Greeks, the Hittites, the Phoenicians, and the Egyptians were either completely wiped out or decimated to the point where it would take centuries to recover. No one knows exactly what happened, but there are vague references to sea people, famines, and droughts. The Iliad and the Exodus may both be a distorted memory of this event. Story 39. It's not a single event so much as the entire reign of one king, but Edward II of England is absolutely fascinating. If your only knowledge of him is the timid character in Braveheart, not remotely historically accurate, then please look up the real person. He had many conflicts with his father, Edward I, also known as Longshanks, who was not quite the villain depicted in Braveheart, but was tyrannical toward his conquests like the Welsh. The English greatly admired him, though both were martially talented, and Edward II was, for all intents and purposes, extremely modern for medieval royalty. For one thing, he floated the idea of actually granting Scotland independence before the Battle of Bannockburn, just to see what they would do with it. He was also as close as a medieval Englishman could get to being openly bisexual, which caused its own problems among the Lords Ordainers, led by his own cousin Thomas, the second Earl Lancaster, because the Plantagenets were quite a dysfunctional family. Edward, Queen Isabella, and Piers Gaveston, who was depicted in Braveheart as the character Longshanks threw out a window, this absolutely did not happen, actually seemed to have a nice little relationship before the Lords Ordainers destroyed it. This caused a schism, as several were very opposed to executing Gaveston on trumped-up charges. This cleared the way for Hugh Despenser the Younger to become the new favorite, and Hugh is likely the inspiration for the character Littlefinger from George R.R. Martin's works. Hugh excluded Queen Isabella, leading to a brutal civil war. And who ends up on top in the end? Why, the Chief Lord Ordainer's younger brother, who kept his nose relatively clean until he couldn't avoid the political turmoil in London anymore, despite having a disability. It's a crime that this hasn't been a movie or television show yet. Story 40. My YouTube algorithm somehow served me a September 11th video a couple of days ago, and I have been watching them ever since. Story 41. Jim Crow. The reality that African Americans and other minorities faced widespread discrimination simply because of race and heritage. Story 42. The Union Battle of Blair Mountain, West Virginia, was the largest labor uprising in American history and the first of 2 times the United States openly bombed its own citizens. There are several excellent documentaries about it, and I highly recommend researching it further. Story 43. The Donner Party is a heartbreaking story. I became deeply interested in it last year. One woman, in particular, stands out. She took care of many of the children. By the end, she had gone blind and was barely sane, yet she kept the children alive. Mrs. Murphy was so kind to the little children that we remember her affectionately. It was always my impression that the last relief party took Frances, Georgia, and Eliza Donner, along with Simon Murphy, from the cabin. As we were ready to start, Mrs. Murphy walked to her bed, laid down, and turned her face toward the wall. One of the men gave her a handful of dried meat. She seemed to realize that we were leaving her and that her work was finished. Story 44. This question makes me think of A Midwife's Tale. It is a diary of a midwife in New England in the late 1700s to early 1800s. It was dismissed as an inconsequential journal until Laurel Thatcher Ulrich discovered it. It is a goldmine of knowledge about the daily life of an ordinary midwife. That entire era and what she wrote about her community is extraordinary. The whole book Ulrich compiled, detailing this journal, is beautiful. My respect and understanding of the trials and joys of those who came before me grew significantly from this book. Story 45. Kenny. The time and effort required to slaughter 50,000 men in one day, one at a time, without explosives or projectiles is unbelievable. The raw calories burned and the feeling of complete satisfaction that Hannibal would have felt, along with the despair and chaos in Rome when news broke, are unimaginable. 8 hours of relentless slaughter. Soldiers would have had to take water breaks, leaving the front line to towel off and drink water before returning to continue the stabbing, slashing, and bludgeoning. Just imagining the cost and resources required for over 30,000 Roman breastplates, swords, gear, and helmets is astonishing. Hundreds of millions of dollars lost. An entire city's fighting population gone. A literal day of mourning was held because there was no one in the city who wasn't affected in one way or another. And yet, somehow, Rome endured. Story 46. It might be a little too recent, but January 6th and the massive parade of fraud and incompetence that led to it and followed it are significant issues. I have no idea why this is not a bigger deal to the average American. I also can't help but wonder what would have happened or where we'd be if one Democrat had failed to evacuate. Story 47. The persecution and extermination of Native Americans and the annexation of their lands by the United States government represent one of the most shameful chapters in U.S. history, and many people remain unaware of it. Story 48. The Beslan school siege resulted in significant casualties, with more than half caused by the Russian military dropping thermobaric bombs onto the school. Story 49. The Apollo 11 moon landing is an incredible achievement that showcases how advanced technology of the 1960s made it possible. Story 50. The growth and subsequent fall of the Roman Empire has left a lasting legacy that continues to influence our judicial, political, and educational systems centuries later. Story 51. I have two titles, although it says one, The Rape of Nanking. I had never heard of it until 5 years ago. The Japanese still do not recognize it as a historical fact. King Leopold and the Congo. I immediately checked out King Leopold's ghost after seeing a picture of a Congolese man sitting on a deck looking at the severed hands and feet of his child because he did not meet the required rubber harvest quota for the day. Story 52. The Bosnian War was the largest conflict in Europe since World War II until the invasion of Ukraine, yet it is rarely discussed for some reason. Story 53. The United States Civil War is a significant historical event. I had the opportunity to visit Gettysburg recently and was filled with excitement. Gettysburg is also a lovely town, not as overly commercialized as one might expect. Story 54. The assassination of John F. Kennedy. The numerous theories about who was responsible and the reasons behind it are incredibly intriguing. Story 55. Nigel Farage caused significant economic damage to the United Kingdom in history, and he is now leading the second most popular party. Story 56. It's probably not accurate to say I'm obsessed with it, because I haven't even read the original book, much less done any research on my own, but I regularly think about Julian Jaynes' theory of the bicameral mentality. Bicameral mentality is a hypothesis introduced by Julian Jaynes, who argued that human ancestors as late as the ancient Greeks did not consider emotions and desires as. Story 57. The Library of Alexandria burned down. How do you accidentally delete humanity's biggest group project and just move on? Story 58. Unit 731 is fascinating. America receives little education about biochemical warfare and human experiments beyond the Holocaust. Story 59. The Holocaust. I am German. My parents immigrated from Germany, and I am fluent in German. However, my family does not often discuss the Holocaust, so I research it on my own extensively. Story 60. The Tunguska event of 1908 was a significant explosion that occurred over Siberia with the force of 1,000 atomic bombs. It flattened 80 million trees, and we still do not know exactly what caused it. I have 3 bookshelves dedicated to this single event. Story 61. If prehistory counts, there was a time when a mass extinction, even worse than the Cretaceous asteroid, occurred, killing off 90% of all species. In the aftermath, the protomammal Lystrosaurus dominated to such an extent that 95% of all land vertebrates were Lystrosaurus for a couple of million years. Story 62. Invasion of Normandy on D-Day. My dad landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day and lived and fought in the mud in France for 2 years. Story 63. I conducted research on the history of snowmen after learning that the earliest recorded mention of snowmen dates back to 1380. I love that this tradition has continued and evolved over time. It's a fascinating part of history that often goes unnoticed, yet it has brought joy to people for centuries. Before the 1950s, snowmen were often elaborate creations made by artists for artistic expression and sometimes used for protests, such as the event in 1511. The sculptor of Abraham Lincoln's tomb created a stunning snow and ice statue in 1857 that gained significant notoriety. Throughout history, artists have faced challenges in acquiring art supplies, leading them to utilize whatever resources were available. Snow became a special medium for sculptures easily accessible to many, regardless of income or social status. It wasn't until the 1940s that snowmen became a popular activity for children, thanks in part to Ruth Herman's book, Snowy the Traveling Snowman, which shaped the modern perception of a snowman in the Western world. Snow sculptures, while temporary, allowed people to invest significant time and effort, which reflects a wonderful aspect of human nature: the desire to create something meaningful, even if it is short-lived. Story 64. Han van Meegeren forged paintings attributed to Johannes Vermeer and had them validated by the highest level of the Dutch art world. He may have gotten away with it had one of the forgeries not been purchased by Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe. There are some excellent books on the topic, and I have read them all. It is truly fascinating. Errol Morris produced a compelling series in the New York Times about it. Guy Pearce portrayed Van Meegeren in a film titled The Last Vermeer. It is not an outstanding film, but it covers the main points. Story 65. The Nixon Administration. It is remarkable how a cold, cerebral, and vindictive person with little charisma could be elected twice after losing twice in disgrace, and have such extremes in terms of achievements and self-inflicted wounds. Story 66. The Punic Wars. I'm eager for a 3-season series about them. The drama, the stakes. It reads like a novel. It was essentially an ancient conflict that determined which regional superpower would dominate the Mediterranean. It's a fascinating chapter of history that doesn't receive the screen time it deserves. Story 67. Taisho and early Meiji-era Japan. Beyond that, lynchings in the United States. In fact, I am working on a mapping project for 20th century lynchings. From 1900 to 1950, I have over 1,300 entries so far, with another roughly 1,000 to go through. Story 68. The Columbian Exchange. I love food history, and it's fascinating to learn how many staple foods originated in the Americas. Story 69. The Culper Ring was an American Revolutionary spy ring made up mostly of a cabbage farmer, a tavern owner, and a former slave in Setauket, Long Island. They provided intelligence from their British-occupied hamlet to Benjamin Talmadge and Caleb Brewster. While others served in the ring, these are the most famous. I cannot quit Tudor history either. Story 70. Cortez brought down Tenochtitlan with just a few hundred Spaniards equipped with cannons and horses. They walked from Veracruz to Mexico City, a city reminiscent of Venice on a lake, forming local alliances against Montezuma to dismantle the empire. Montezuma believed they were gods. Smallpox, volcanoes, prophecies, slavery, religion, and wealth are all part of this compelling story. Story 71. In Anatolia, Turkey, the oldest city in the world dates back to 12,000 BCE and is known as Göbekli Tepe and Karahanlı Tepe. It is so early that it does not have hallways. Instead, it consists of a series of large and small rooms. It is theorized that when someone died, the rooms were filled in, and construction continued on top. Only a fraction of Karahanlı Tepe has been excavated, and there could be thousands of rooms and layers filled in beneath. Story 72. World War I. Imagine signing up for the army after hearing war stories from your grandfather, thinking you are going to find glory and be a hero. You are underage, 16 years old, so you lie and say you are 18. Then you find yourself living in an inhospitable trench, under constant artillery barrages, chemical weapon attacks that melt your insides, brutal hand-to-hand combat from trench raids, and snipers targeting every inch above your head. One day, you are ordered to charge no man's land, where you get stuck in barbed wire and are mowed down by a machine gun, your body left in the mud to be eaten by rats, all for an attempt to gain a few meters of land. No glory whatsoever. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.